Hi, everybody. This is part 2 that you're watching of the 3-part webinar on APA format and citations. In this part 2 video, I'm going to focus on in-text citations in particular and how to format them. So before I talk specifically about in-text citations, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the difference between in-text and references citations, and also why and when we cite at all. I mean, obviously, you know, you're going to cite sources to give credit where credit is due, but when do you need to cite sources? And this slide will show you that you're going to cite sources when you quote, paraphrase, summarize, or reference specific facts and data. So really, anytime you're borrowing ideas and information from another source that isn't common knowledge. And what I mean by that, common knowledge is it's commonly known. You can find that information in a lot of different places, not just one particular source. So if something is common knowledge, then you would not necessarily need to cite it. So let me give you an example. There's 2 sentences here on the right side of this slide. The first one is a known fact and would not require a citation. It's common knowledge. So Blood Simple is the debut feature film from Joel and Ethan Coen. You can find that information from a lot of places. It's just a fact. The second sentence, however, that's an idea from someone else that should be credited for that idea. Blood Simple is celebrated as a postmodern neo-noir. So then we give credit to the author and mention the date of publication of the source in which we found this information. Now, the difference between in-text citations and references. In-text citations are used to indicate when words or ideas are borrowed within the body of your text. They're often placed inside parentheses, and they should guide a reader toward the full citation that shows up at the end of the paper in the references list. The references list, as I mentioned in the first part of this webinar series, that appears on a new page at the end of the paper, and it catalogs in alphabetical order all of the sources that have been consulted in the creation of that paper. So I mentioned that your in-text citations should help the reader find the full citation for that source in the references page. Here's an example of how that works. You have your parenthetical citation. The author's name is Alexander, their last name is Alexander, publication date 2018. And then you see there in the references list entry, Alexander, the author's last name, is the first thing that appears in this full citation. So it's a really quick reference way to go from your in-text parenthetical citation all the way to that references list if you want to see more information about that source, the full citation, so you can go in and find that if you want more information or you want to read it directly. Okay, so the third part of this webinar series is going to focus on the references list citations, but this webinar, or this part of the webinar, is going to focus on the in-text citations. For parenthetical in-text citations, you'll want to include the author's last name, the date of publication, and if you're quoting from that source, the page number as well. So this would look like Jones, comma, 1998, the year of publication, or Jones, 1998, page 199. So depending on if you're quoting from that source or not, that's when you would include the page number in addition to the author's last name and the year of publication. For a narrative in-text citation, you'll include the date of publication immediately following the author's name, unless both of those things appear in the narrative. And you can see 2 examples below. This table shows what to do if you have a single author or multiple authors or an unknown author or even an organization as an author. So if you just have a single author for your parenthetical citation, you'll put the author's last name and then comma and the year of publication as we've seen in previous examples. If, however, you have two authors, you'll use both authors' last name in the order that they appear in that original source. And you'll put an ampersand or an and symbol in between those two names, followed by comma and the year of publication as usual. This is slightly different for the newest edition of APA format. Previously, you would have to list several names at a time if there were many authors working on a piece, but now for your in-text citations at least, if you have 3 or more authors, you only have to list the first author's last name and then et al. Notice the punctuation around et al. And then the date of publication. If there is not a known author for the source that you're using, this is uncommon, but it can happen. You would go to the next thing after the publication date that would normally appear in that full citation. So usually that would mean it's the title of the text. So you'll see here in this in-text citation, a shortened version of the title of the text instead of or replacing the author's last name, since we don't know the author's last name. And then sometimes you'll have an organization listed as the author of a text. And so here's an example of that. The first time this source was mentioned in a text with American Psychological Association as the author of that source, we listed out the full title of that organization, followed by an abbreviated version of the name of the organization in brackets, APA. And then when you reference that same source again in the paper, you can use just the abbreviated version of the organization. And that just helps with readability of that parenthetical citation as you're going through the text. All right, some other scenarios for in-text citations. If you're citing multiple works, all within a single parenthetical citation for one sentence, then you would just separate those with a semicolon. And you would list them in the order that they appear in that sentence, or alphabetically if you're saying this topic is covered by several authors in the scholarship around this issue, and then you could list the sources in alphabetical order separated by a semicolon. If you have multiple sources that have the same author last name, then you would just incorporate their first name initials into those in-text citations, as you can see in this example. Okay, sometimes you'll encounter a source that has been translated from the original language, or maybe reprinted at a later date, republished, or reissued. So if you run into a source like that, this is how you would handle it. You would just include both dates, the original and the new version, separated by a slash. If you just generally mention, for an example, a website or a periodical or an app or a technology, something like that, within your paper, you don't need to include that in your citations. Here's an example. If you want to mention that you created a survey using Qualtrics, you would mention that and maybe give the website, but it doesn't need to show up in your references list. So some people, when they are, writing a paper that uses a lot of outside sources, they start to get bogged down in the citation of it. And by that, I mean they worry like, I'm having to put citations in almost every sentence. It's making it maybe difficult for the reader to just follow along because there's all these interjections of parenthetical citations. Do I really need all of them? And to answer that, I would say, generally, yes, it's better safe than sorry. If you're including borrowed information, you want to give credit so that your reader knows that that information has been borrowed and you're not trying to pass it off as your own. But there are some different ways that you can do that. So these next couple of slides will address how to do that in a way that makes your text still readable. So in general, include the author and date in every in-text citation, but the year can be omitted from a citation when multiple narrative citations show up in a row, like within a single paragraph. In this paragraph right here, take a minute to read through it, shows you an example of what that could look like. All of the in-text citations have been bolded to point out to you. So when you are citing one source multiple times within a paragraph, you can, well, you need to cite the source every time that you're borrowing information from it, but you can do it in a couple of ways. You can include the year in the first narrative citation and then omit from subsequent, like we saw in the previous slide. Or you can include the year in every parenthetical citation. So if you're citing only one study within the same paragraph multiple times, then you can alternate between a parenthetical citation and an in-text citation to aid readability. Alternatively, you can use language that makes clear where ideas originate. So once you begin a new paragraph, though, even if you're still using information from the same source that you were just talking about, you should still clearly identify the source again and include a new in-text citation. Okay, in this slide, the top example shows a narrative and parenthetical citation mix, and the bottom example makes use of guiding language where you guide the reader through how you're using source information within this paragraph. So one isn't necessarily better than the other. They may just be fitting for different occasions. So you have to think about what's your purpose for writing and which style might make more sense for you. So pause the slide, take a minute to read through this and see what your impressions are and how you might incorporate these different methods for in-text citations into your own writing. Okay, that's the end of this second video in the APA webinar series. So far, we've talked about APA format and we've talked about APA in-text citations. If you check out the third part of this webinar series, you'll get a lot of information about what to do with your full citations in the references list. So I hope that you'll check that one out next.